Take two. I couldn't see the chat. I got it working now though. So I know I'm a day early. We are going to LA tomorrow, and I was just going to record it in LA. But then our schedule shifted a bit, and I'll actually be driving to LA during the time when I would normally be doing this. So I didn't want to skip a week. And I'm very excited for this week. So the next 2 weeks, I'm going to get back to some of the community questions that have come in over the last like month or couple months of doing this. Really great questions. Today's going to be a little bit more scientific, so if that's your cup of tea, enjoy, and feel free to ask follow-up questions as well. A lot of this is things that I learned. I took a lot of different courses in university, microbiology and psychobiology and things, and super big into learning about science. I also studied religion pretty heavily, so I got a master's in theology from Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, which some people might think is extremely liberal, but in my opinion was extremely conservative. I expected it to be far more sort of progressive than it was. Surprised me a lot. But anyway, all that to say, I've studied a lot of these topics heavily, and in my very first week of doing this, we talked about how to think. And so I walked through like sort of when something new enters your world, how to approach it mentally and cognitively. And we had a really great question come out of that session, which was basically like, okay, so you're advocating for a bunch of evidence. And this person was like, what do you think of all the evidence of Noah's flood? And I don't know exactly what this person was referencing, because my understanding is that there isn't really too much evidence for the flood. There's like ad hoc things that very sort of propaganda mill places like Answers in Genesis and places like that will try to kick out there. And my dad is a big young earth creationist, which is very funny. And so he would always have me like read books and stuff from this mindset that would sort of try to make a bunch of claims. But if you dig into the science, if you spend more than 5 or 10 minutes digging into some of the stuff, it becomes very clear that the evidence sort of points in a very different direction than the flood narrative does. So I'm not clear what this person is referencing. But anyway, we're going to walk through the evidence that I know of and things from my past that I've researched, and then also current research as well. So feel free to ask questions about this presentation. I have a link on my website. So I used to work at Meta, and what sort of rose the ranks in the tech industry, became an executive there, and then switched to helping other people become sort of healthy, or they're unlocking their own potential through physical strength and mental strength. And so I essentially coach people who are making an impact in the world now. Help them get their body into a healthy spot, help them get their mind into a healthy spot. And it's been incredibly fulfilling and satisfying and fun. But so anyway, I have a link on my website, which is fitnerds.club. And you can go to Ghost Church and you can ask a question here. There's a little input form. So I receive those, and then I will tackle the question on the stream. So I know it's taken me a couple months to get to some of these questions, and I have a few more to answer, and I'll do another question next week. And then I have some other stuff that I want to talk about. We were kind of talking about how to build a better world and what the process for that was, and I want to go a little bit more in depth into some of those things. But today we're going to talk a little bit about this kind of, you see that? Good. Talk about this question. So this is going to be very technical and very focused on this question. So if this isn't your cup of tea, feel free to skip this one. If you have a question yourself on any topic really, feel free to submit it. And I'm happy to share my knowledge and then also do some research on it too. So anyways, so this is sort of a few things on this one. A few follow-ups to the week one, which should be on the Twitch page. If you go to the video called How to Think, we walk through sort of a variety of different interesting concepts there. And I was really happy with that one. I may turn it into a YouTube video. But to follow up on that and to start this conversation off, I I actually don't know why I am using my AirPods right now. I'm going to take them out. Hopefully it doesn't fuck anything up. I think I have the mic. Yeah, that's so much better. It was hard to think. Okay, so how to think toolkit. Step 1, take out your AirPods. So the first point I want to make here is that this is a phenomenon that I see very often when talking with other people, and I see in the national discourse on various topics, and I also see in my family and various places, which is that x equals 0 does not mean that y equals 1. So to go back to the kind of murder analogy that we were using in the How to Think presentation, if I could prove all day long that the butler did not kill the person, and that's great because then we know that the butler is innocent and free. But just because we can prove or have tons of evidence that the butler did not do it, that does not mean that the mailman did do it. We would then separately need to prove that the mailman did it. So disproving one thing doesn't prove another thing, especially in conversations like the flood conversation often gets wrapped up in like origin of life conversations and creationism conversations versus evolution conversations, things like that. For some reason. But even if you were to disprove evolution, like even if you mounted a ton of different evidence and were able to demonstrate that evolution probably isn't accurate as a theory, that does not then prove that God created the world, for example. Those are separate things. So x equals 0, evolution being false, does not mean that God created the universe is true. You would still need to demonstrate that a God exists, can create universes, then use his universe creating power to create a universe. This is often called a false dichotomy, and I see it all over the place. Like even, for example, I was trying to schedule a get-together with my cousins who I like a lot. And for some reason, it was coming down to these like 2 dates. I kept saying things like, well, there's lots of other dates that we could do it, and then there's lots of other dates next year we could do it, and even the year after that we could do it. Why are we like setting up this false dichotomy between these 2 dates? But yeah, there's even if you disprove one thing, it doesn't mean that you've proven the other thing. You still need to prove the other thing. So the reason I wanted to mention that is because we're going to get into some of this evidence, and even if you have issues with some of this evidence or you debunk some of it or whatever, that still doesn't mean that the flood is real or that it happened. You would need substantial evidence that the flood happened in order to make that reasonably a possibility that it actually occurred. So I think a lot of people don't really understand that concept, and if you add that to your How to Think toolkit, I think it'll take you a long way. You see this kind of rhetoric in politics and stuff like that all the time. Okay, and then the second piece is we don't know, therefore it's magic. I see this kind of thinking all the time. If we don't know how life got started on the planet, for example, people are like, oh, a god did it. Like, do you know how your phone works? Most of the time the answer is no. Does that mean that it's magic? No. Like, I think a lot of times people have problems with saying the answer, I don't know, which is a perfectly valid response. And just because we don't know something does not mean we get to sub in whatever explanation that we want. So we saw this happening in human history a lot. So like we didn't know what lightning was or how it worked. So it'd be like, oh, a god did it. So we don't know, therefore it's magic. Same with volcanoes or the sun rising and setting. We just didn't know, so we attributed it to magic. So we've been doing this for hundreds of thousands of years as a species, so I get the impulse. But one of the How to Think toolkit things that I wanted to bring up here is like, even if we don't know something, like, for example, the origin of life on this planet is called abiogenesis, and it's firmly systems chemistry. It doesn't have anything to do with evolution, which is firmly biology. People get that confused a lot. But if you're talking about systems chemistry and chemistry in general, and you're talking about abiogenesis specifically, the polymerization of ribonucleotides, homochirality, all that stuff, let's say there's 10 steps to the process. We might know steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 9. So do we know the whole thing? No, there's some steps we don't know how they work. But it's not like we don't know any of the steps. And Because we don't know all the steps, like we're missing step 7 or whatever, that doesn't mean we can then say, oh, we don't know how it actually happened yet. Therefore, I'm going to believe that a God did it. So anytime this happens just so much where someone is like, well, I don't know what happened there. Therefore, I'm going to believe this random thing. Sort of like back to the murder example. If we can't prove that it was murder, people are like, I'm going to believe, therefore, that he died of natural causes. My mom did this for her father's death, for example. I think so he committed suicide and he left a note. And for a lot of years, whenever I would talk to her about it, she would kind of like disprove that he committed suicide, essentially, where people just kind of sub in whatever they want to believe because they're not sure what actually happened or why it happened or something. And so they just kind of choose to fill in a thing. So that's a cognitive piece that you need to be aware of too, is your brain really likes to do that. We've talked about cognitive biases before, but basically like your brain doesn't really like not knowing things. The unknown is very dangerous, and that makes sense evolutionarily, right? Like if you can't understand something or don't know what something is, it could potentially be dangerous. So sort of a paranoia about the unknown is actually very helpful to survival. But in the modern world, we apply that to lots of different things. And there's so much stuff that we don't understand how it works. Things in our daily life, how our car works, how our phone works, how, like, whatever. And in some cases, we're very good about not just randomly attributing it to magic. We just kind of randomly attribute it to, like, science or technology or whatever it is. But we don't actually know anything about it. And so there's this impulse often, especially with origin of life things or philosophical things, to suddenly bring in this like other entity that we've never proven exists, which is very interesting and has been common for a lot of time. So anyway, I wanted to bring up those two things as we kind of go through this because some of this stuff might come up for you as you're thinking about this stuff. Okay, so focusing on this question, what do you think of all the evidence for Noah's flood? So first of all, there's a lot of flood narratives out there in a lot of different cultures, but this question obviously is talking about the Christian version of that, or maybe technically the Hebrew version of this, which is the precursor to the Christian narrative. So that's the one I'm going to focus on, but if you have other questions about other flood narratives, please let me know. But I did want to start with where the sort of Hebrew or Christian version came from. So it's very obviously copied from other narratives. So the Eridu Genesis was about at least 700 years earlier. These dates are a little fluid and estimates. But at least 700 years earlier. The Ultrahasis is at least 800 years earlier than this. And, whoa, that's so cool. The Babylonian Gilgamesh, talent number 11, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, is at least 100 years earlier. And that's the one that the biblical narrative pulls the most from, mainly because the Hebrews were captured by the Babylonians. So there was a lot of cultural diffusion there. And so scholars have traced a lot of like cultural diffusion across a lot of different axes there and vectors. But literature and narratives and storytelling is one of those vectors. And so it's not surprising that the scholars in the Hebrew world, after being occupied and taken over by the Babylonians, there was some cultural diffusion there. So they basically kind of adopted this story and then modified it to be their own theology. So it's not in any way an original Hebrew or Christian kind of a thing. It's a grand epic poem kind of narrative thing. So right away, that kind of eliminates any need for scientific backing of it, because it's not meant to be a scientific document of any kind. It's a narrative. It's like an epic poem. So how do we know that it was clearly copied? This is an artwork by someone who I really like, and she does like a rendition of the entire flood story, and it's very, very interesting. She's just like reading the text, but adds her own artwork to it, and I absolutely love it, because it's when you sort of see it in this way, it's very clear that it's basically like an epic narrative, epic poem kind of thing, like a comic book, basically. So how do we know that it's clearly copied? All of the stories describe like an ark or a boat with multiple decks, a roof, and a window. So they're all basic same construction. They all also have basically exactly the same units for dimensional footprint, like basically the same size, to a degree where it would be very weird for that to be a coincidence. There are different shapes. Some of the arcs are round, which was a very common boat. I forget what those are called, but there's like a very common boat in the Near East that's rounded. And people have been using them for thousands of years. And so I think that's why it was round. In some narratives, it's a cube, and some it's a rectangle. So kind of different shapes, but interestingly, the same sort of dimensional footprint is exactly the same. They all are coated with bitumen, which is like a waterproofing agent from the ancient world on the outside to make things float. Very commonly used. It's like tar, kind of. But that detail has survived through all of these different versions of it. And then they all describe saving domestic and wild animals. And interestingly, the line 2x2 is present as well, which people think of as relating to Genesis. But again, it was a precursor to Genesis, so Genesis just kind of copied that. And then they all release birds to tell if the world is okay. So the hero in these other versions will release like a dove and then a swallow and then a raven, and then the raven doesn't return. In some of them, they release a dove and then a crane, like in the Ugaritic fragment. And then in the biblical narrative, I think it's like a raven and then a swallow maybe, and then a dove at the end or something like that. And then the dove doesn't come back. I think he has to do it multiple times with the dove, if I remember correctly. And then at some point, he brings back an olive branch, which is like, so in a year of time after all the plants died, an olive tree grew to the point where it had a branch. So the world is underwater for like a year, and then the waters recede, and then it doesn't really make sense. Anyway, so that's why we know that it was copied, is because these earlier versions have a lot of these details, and the basic structure is exactly the same, and even the details are very similar. In fact, the words, you can just tell that they kind of like even copied. Like the term for arc and bitumen are essentially just kind of copied or transliterated words from the earlier versions. Hebrew doesn't really have this word or this word, and so they kind of, and then they added olive branch too, because that's a tree that is in the area where the Hebrews lived, but not in the other Mesopotamian areas where these other narratives came from, which is interesting too. So anyway, all that to say, there's like been a bunch of scholarly work on the origin of the flood story, and it's definitely not a Hebrew origin story or a Christian origin story. It comes from these other religions and other areas in Mesopotamia. So I wanted to mention that first. Then we're going to go through a table. I fucking love a good table. We haven't done one on Ghost Church before, but I'm going to kind of go through this. This is going to get a bit technical, so again, ask questions if you'd like to. So I'm just going to kind of go through, since the question was, what do you think of all the evidence for the flood? I sort of framed this in terms of like, what evidence would we expect to find if there was a flood? And do we find that? So just thinking of it very kind of logically and scientifically, like if there was a global flood that covered the entire earth in the kind of that followed the Christian narrative, what kind of actual evidence would we expect to see? So that's the frame through which I'm going to approach this. So let's just look at stratigraphy and sediments, basically rock layers and geology first. So if there was a big flood, what we would expect to find is like a continuous, globally uniform mega sequence of sediments all laid down at the same time. So this kind of like massive layer. Think of it like the K2 barrier or whatever from the giant meteor that hit us and supposedly wiped out the dinosaurs and things. I think that K2 barrier is like a global layer of ash that they can find all over the place. You would find kind of a similar thing with this mega sequence of sediments all laid down at the same time. Like this, it would just basically be like sort of like stratified layers over time being laid down until the flood happened, and it would be this like massive layer that was all kinds of chaos laid down, and then again after that, then more layers. So you would be able to see very clearly that massive flood layer in pretty much any, like all over the world, and any place could see exposed rock layers. It would also be very chaotic. So lots of crossbends everywhere, basically no soil horizons, no desert dunes, no paleosols, no lengthy erosion surfaces. Like paleosols are basically like topsoil absorbs the oxygen and the atmosphere of the planet and has biomass and things like that. So it's like a good snapshot window into the biosphere at that particular time. But we wouldn't find those in this massive mega sequence layer because there wouldn't be time for topsoil to develop and absorb oxygen and the atmosphere composition things and the biomass and everything, like microbiome and things. That kind of part of the rock layer wouldn't exist because it would just be this chaos layer from the flood. Like same kind of thing, like you wouldn't find desert dunes in this layer because they wouldn't have had time to form. You wouldn't have been able to see erosion of any kind during this time because that wouldn't have had time to form either. Basically, it would just be kind of like chaos, sediments, animals, plants, bones, like all kinds of stuff in there. So none of these other things would be present there. And what we actually find is very ordered stacked layers that are very clearly laid down over time that are not chaos. And you can see erosion, you can see desert dunes, you can see ancient soils and those paleosols. You can see multiple reef complexes. So like coral take quite a while to form. And so the fact that we can see coral reefs like form and then die and change in how the organisms work and all that stuff over time, and we don't have a clear like, and then all of the coral was wiped out and it took a long time to regenerate. We don't have anything like that. We don't have these evaporate basins either. So like you can tell when soil gets rained on or wet and then it evaporates. That's also captured in the rock layer, and that wouldn't be happening during the flood period either. So the fact that there's these kind of like very natural processes that are pretty slow, like dunes, erosion, evaporate basins, like all of that stuff, coral reefs, and you can kind of see their lineage over time, and there's no massive breaks or anything like that that we can see, is directly contradictory to what we expect to see. So I have a few pictures here. So this is like more what we would expect to see. This is an example of what a layer laid down that was rapidly laid down from a flood looks like. You can just see it's just like all over the place. I mean, it looks like a flood, right? Just sediments that's chaotic and laid down all quickly. And this has been fossilized. This is instead what we see, which is just very clearly not this. And here's what an example of a fossilized coral reef looks like. So you can see the coral growing, and then it was covered in sediment, and then, yeah. So anyway, all that to say, like, the evidence that we would expect from a sediment perspective, from a global massive flood that killed a bunch of stuff, we just don't see that. It would be totally cool if we did see that. Right, like if the rock layers all over the planet were more like what we would expect, then scientists would be like, oh, there must have been a global flood. But that's not what we see. So therefore we are like, okay, that probably didn't happen then. This isn't about if the Bible is true or not, or if there's a God or not. This is whether or not there was a global flood that destroyed a bunch of animals and plants all at the same time, and what we would expect to see. And just from a sediment perspective, we don't see what we would expect to see, basically. Okay, kind of related, fossil pattern. So we would see all kinds of animals and plants buried together. So you would see dinosaurs and humans buried together. You'd see foxes and trilobites and everything buried together. Especially as the water came up onto the land. All of the animals were supposedly created So you would see like hippos and giraffes and all kinds of stuff being together, buried together with humans and dinosaurs, which supposedly lived at the same time. And they would just be randomly sorted. So like animals that were more near the shorelines at the time would obviously be buried first, but then things on the land, the plants and the animals of any kind would all be essentially just buried together. So the progression would be proximity to the coastline, but after that, as you know from the animals being all over the place, like animals and plants and humans and everything are just all kind of living together. And so if there was a sudden wave or water that dumped on top of you, it would all be mixed up together. And supposedly all of the rock layers that you see, according to people who believe in the flood, were all laid down during this time. But we don't see that mix. Instead, what we see is a very consistent vertical order. So there's essentially like very simple organisms on the bottom. Then you get more complex organisms like dinosaurs. Then you get more complex organisms like hominin fossils. And we also see complete ecosystems kind of at every level. So you see like nests and burrows and pollen zones and those sorts of things. And all of this stuff would be impossible to form in violent floodwaters. So this is a very famous image from like the Encyclopedia Britannica from back in the day. So it was very nostalgic. So I included it. But you can find lots of different images of how this works. But you can basically see organisms over time. And it's very predictable. And we see it all over the planet. It's basically like in the layers that are the lowest are the simplest life forms, and then they get more complex over time, and then plants happen, and then more complex life forms happen over time. So if the flood was real, you wouldn't see this at all. You would see a mix at the bottom because apparently all the animals were created at the same time, boom, out of nowhere, and they were fully formed by some sort of deity. So you would see a mix of everything here, and then you would see a huge jumble of everything in one massive layer. And then you would see, I guess, less stuff because things, even though Noah saved a bunch of animals, they still went extinct for some reason. So you would see less stuff up here. But it would basically be all the same stuff throughout the entire column. Random stuff here because everything was present and it would just die and get covered and fossilize. And then a massive layer with everything all jumbled together from the flood. And then a layer with less diversity up here because apparently stuff has died out and gone extinct. But that's not at all what we see. We see simple to more complex to plants to even more complex to even more complex as time goes on. The next one is radiometric isotopes. So this is a super hot topic. But basically what you would expect to see if there was a massive flood is sort of a massive reset with this. Radiometric isotopes are essentially isotopes that will change into different isotopes over time. So this gets a little bit technical, but that ratio where there's a different amount of parent to daughter is a way of gauging how long something has been alive. Because if there's like 100 parent, so in this, let's take the potassium argon example. So if there's 100 potassium atoms, after a certain amount of time, there will be only 50% of the potassium atoms and 50% of the argon atoms because it's decayed. And we know what those decay rates are, so we can then back calculate how old that thing is. This is a very inexact science, and so that's why we have multiple methods. So we'll use one method and reach a certain date, and then we'll have another method and see if it corroborates that date, and then we'll have another method and see if it corroborates that date. So if the dates are all over the place, then the scientists don't feel comfortable dating something, which is why you can't date all specimens. What you need is like a specimen that has kind of a closed system where the rock hasn't been reheated in any way, because that can reset some of these clocks. So this is a very, very intense science. But basically what you would expect if there was an actual flood is these clocks would be kind of reset. And so long life isotopes would be unable to reach their current ages, essentially. But instead what we see is very consistent ages from over 20 different isotopic systems. So in order to eliminate as much error as possible, we've developed many, many different isotopic systems because there's many different radioactive decay vectors. And then zircons are another way that we do this. And then there's another thing called isochron dating too that eliminates some of the assumptions that we need to make in order to make this work. So basically the point is we're getting better and better at this dating method all the time. But it's definitely an imperfect type of dating method, and we're just improving it over time. Basically, there's not a lot of systems that are fully, truly isolated systems. So it's hard to know if some of those isotopes were generated from a different event or added in later or altered in some way. And so scientists do the best they can. That's why they try to use as many different methods and corroborate those results as they can. And if they can't, they just don't date it, which makes sense. But this is just one dating methodology that we use. That being said, what we do find with the presence of these long half-life isotopes, we find a vast difference than what we would expect to find because these radio isotopes would have been essentially reset at the flood, but yet we find ones that are ultra, ultra old. Here's a look at the isochron dating that I was talking about and how it works. I would highly encourage you to research how this works because a lot of times people who advocate for flood evidence will just not have any clue how it works, and they'll say things like, "Oh, it's not very accurate," or "It throws a bunch of errors a lot of times." So therefore, it's scientists trying to be mustache twiddling, like charlatans or whatever, and that's not at all how that works. We're doing the best we can with the tools that we have is essentially how it works. But trying to understand how old something is a pretty tough problem to solve. And shitting on scientists who devote their lives to these things and try to make this better and better over time is not an appropriate response. So educate yourself and understand how radiometric dating works. It's decently complicated and has a lot of like physics and chemistry knowledge that you need to know in order to really understand it. But there's some good sort of summary videos and things. And as I said, there's multiple lines over 40 different systems that we can use. So if you have 10 different systems and you date a rock with 10 different systems and they all show the same age, then that's a pretty good indicator that rock is that age. It might be off, we're doing the best we can. But again, as time goes on, these systems get better and better. And it's not okay to just say, "Oh, it's wrong sometimes, so therefore we should throw it completely out and we shouldn't make it better over time." That's ridiculous. Another piece of evidence is ice cores and lake varves. So lake varves are basically like the lake will change and the sediment that gets washed up at the edge of the lake will change over time. And so you can it's sort of like a ring in a way. So you can kind of see that in geologic geologic rock layers. Ice cores basically are a similar mechanism. So like the ice will melt and then refreeze as the seasons transition on the planet. As the planet kind of orbits the sun, the seasons change, and so the ice will essentially change. And so that melting and refreezing cycle is called one core. Just like with the lake, the kind of receding and then filling back up is called one varve. So in what you would expect to find in ice cores is less than 5,000 of them. It's sort of, you can think of it like tree rings, basically. So like that melting and refreezing would be one tree ring or one layer. So we would find less than 5,000 annual layers, depending on when you put the flood. If you put it 4,000 years ago or 6,000 years ago or whatever, we would find less than whatever that threshold is. And same with lake varves too. Because the post-flood climate is all that exists. So all that stuff would have been massively reset at that point. And even like if there was ice and then it was all covered with water and even if it didn't all melt and then the waters receded and then it started its cycle again, we would see a dramatic cut during that time period in the cores as well, which we do not see. And instead what we find of this, so we would expect to find less than 5,000 or 4,000 or 6,000 or whatever. Instead what we find is that Greenland has about 130,000 distinct annual layers in ice cores. Antarctica has about 800,000. And then as far as the varves go, the longest we've ever seen those, which are much more challenging to study and capture, is about 70,000. So these are dramatically higher than what you would expect from this kind of flood narrative. And this is some scientists doing the ice core work. So they basically drill down, take a sample, and are able to analyze it and see where the annual marks are. Genetics and population size. So you would expect a very tight bottleneck suddenly around 4, 5, 6,000 years ago, whatever, because there were only 8 humans on the ark. So you would see a very low natural diversity and a kind of starburst coalescence when you do genomics on these various species and humans and things, because there was this massive bottleneck event at whenever the flood happened, and then suddenly all diversity on the planet today came from 2 giraffes or 8 humans or whatever it is, which is not much time to reach the diversity that we have. But that's what you would essentially see. So you would see very low genetic diversity and this kind of starburst coalescence from genomics from a single point. And we don't find that at all. So human mitochondrial and Y chromosome diversity means that there's been vast population sizes of at least a few thousand humans for at least 100,000 years, just mathematically. The current diversity genomically means that there had to have been large populations for at least 100,000 years to reach the current level. You could, as I mentioned at the top of this, you could just sub in magic, just be like, oh, I don't know how that happened, therefore it was magic. The deity did it. And you could do that with pretty much any of this stuff, like, this fossil pattern exists because the deity wanted it that way, so it just like poofed it into existence. Like, sure, you can use that argument for anything, but I can do the same thing. I can just be like, magic space wizard duck did all of this. And so the reason why we see this well-ordered layers is because the space wizard duck just poofed that into existence. Like it does. You can use that argument for anything. You could say Zeus did it. You could say Ganesh did it, like whatever. It doesn't in any way help you to do that because there's no reason why your particular god or whatever did that. And it's also just completely ridiculous. It's like saying, I don't know how my phone works, so my god must have made the phone for me. Like, you can say that all you want. Doesn't make it true. Anyway, so that's the genetic part of it. Craters are the last piece of evidence I wanted to talk about here. So what you would expect to find if there was an actual flood was meteorite craters that are older, and then a big break where there's this massive chaos flood layer that gets laid down, where all these layers get laid down super fast in the geologic column. And then meteorite craters that are all very fresh since the flood. But we don't find that at all. Instead, we find craters at various levels that have erosion signs. So what had to have happened is that the meteorite had to have hit, formed a crater, there was erosion and cycles happening, and then slowly over time that got filled in and became a rock layer, which is exactly what you would expect if the Earth was much older. So the fact that we find craters at pretty much every level and they show signs of erosion is very different than what we would expect to find if there was a massive worldwide flood. And so here you can see some of these eroded craters. So I'm going to then go into some preclusionary evidence. So this is evidence that we have found that, in my opinion, completely destroys the idea of a worldwide flood. So I'm going to go through that real quick. So contrary to the question askers talking about clear evidence for the flood, I haven't found any. The evidence that we do find basically contradicts what we would expect to find, and it in addition to all of that, we find evidence that, in my opinion, completely precludes the idea of a global flood. So because we find this evidence, it means that there's probably not been a global flood. And the first one of those things is the heat problem. So because of the radioactive decay that we talked about being present, and some of these radioactive elements that need a long time to decay in order to happen are present, a lot of times people who believe in the flood will try to cram in, because it exists and we can see it, they'll try to cram that radioactive decay into the flood into that year of the flood. So they basically say something like, oh, well, during that flood year, like physics broke. And so the radioactive decay like super sped up, which we've tried to do that in labs for years and never been able to accomplish that. So we have there's no way that we know of where we can increase radioactive decay. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, if you were to cram in millions of years of radioactive decay into a single year, the heat that would generate would vaporize the crust of the Earth. Likewise, we have strong evidence that the continents were in vastly different positions multiple times throughout human history, and I can go into the details of that in another video if you want, but overwhelming evidence that like Pangea existed, various other supercontinents existed over time. So for the continents to get from where they were, which we have strong evidence for, to where they are now would mean that the continents during the flood would need to move at race car speeds apart from each other into their current positions, and the heat generated from the continents driving as fast as a race car across the planet would also vaporize the crust of the Earth. So like there's just like, again, it's basically just being like, oh, magic happened. Cool. Like doesn't help in any way. And there's no evidence for that, because even if there was like a magical thing that occurred and the continents just like popped from one spot to another or something with no heat problem whatsoever, like we would see the effects of that in the geologic column that we study. And we don't see that at all. We see a slow drift over time where you can see the subduction zones, you can see mountain ranges being formed over time, crust being pushed up, like all the kind of natural processes that we see have histories and don't have like this massive sheer break where suddenly like magic happened and like the continents were clearly like relocated via some sort of magic space wizard or anything. That would leave clear fingerprints in the geologic column. We don't see that at all. So this kind of heat problem with radioactive decay on the continents, in my opinion, the fact that we have so much clear evidence of how tectonics works and how mountain ranges form and how volcanoes work and subduction zones and all that stuff, which has been studied for a long time and has lots of actual visual evidence and also like just mountains of evidence, and is how just basic geology works. The fact that we have that essentially precludes this idea of a global flood. The second thing that I wanted to mention is the energy and mineral industries are massive. They're about a $257 billion industry combined, and they use the best geology and geochemistry science out there, which is all predicated on these natural processes that I was just talking about. And they do not base their industry on fantasy flood science. So if fantasy flood science was more accurate or better in some way, this massive industry would base their entire industry on that science instead, but they don't. Their job is to make as much money as possible. And so they're going to want to use the best, most accurate stuff. And so the fact that the energy industry and the mineral industry doesn't use fantasy flood science and instead uses the best current geology and geochemical science, to me tells me that that science is much, much better and more robust. And I'd say that's pretty preclusionary. Yeah, so that's the second one. Third one might be a little surprising, which is soft tissue. And the reason it might be surprising is because I think a lot of times people who advocate for the flood will mention soft tissue, because they're like, we can kind of extract soft tissue out of dinosaurs and things like that. And they're like, well, that wouldn't be possible if the Earth was millions of years old, essentially is their argument, because they don't know how it works. But my argument here is basically that the amount of soft tissue that we can extract scales. So if you get the remains of a Neanderthal or some sort of more recent species and you discover that as an archaeologist, you can extract almost a full genome out of that thing, which is awesome. But something that's much, much older, like a dinosaur or even before that, a trilobite or something, you can get maybe like some shitty fragments of a genome, but hardly anything else. So what that if everything was buried together and everything lived at the same time and everything was kind of massively put down, all the geologic column was massively put down during the flood, as flood people claim, you'd be able to get the same amount of genome out of any fossil, but we don't see that. Things that are much further down, which traditional science says is much older, you can't hardly get any kind of genome out of that thing. And things that are much higher, which traditional science says is much younger, you can get almost full genome out of. So why would that be the case? If everything was buried together and this generally the same age, why would we be able to pull genomes out of one organism and not another one? Doesn't make any sense. So that's my third preclusionary piece of evidence. Plankton is another one. I almost put plants on here, but I'm going to just stick with plankton for now. So plankton comes in a lot of different varieties, and also there's a large biomass of it in general. And we see that biomass, we can trace it throughout the rock layers and throughout time. And what would happen if there was a flood is that you have the salt water of the ocean, and then you have a whole bunch of fresh water that either like came up from underneath the Earth's crust somehow, or some people talk about there was like a bubble of water around the Earth or whatever that all crashed down. But basically what you would have is like either a complete saltwater Earth or a complete freshwater Earth or a brackish Earth, which is like the mixing of salt and freshwater to different salinities. And plankton is ultra sensitive to salinity. So if you have plankton in freshwater and you put a little saltwater in there, it will die immediately. And same with saltwater plankton. If you put too much freshwater, the salinity goes down hardly at all, it will die. So plankton would not have survived at all the flood. And so you would see in the geologic layers like this layer of just massive amounts of dead plankton, because it all would have died, either saltwater or freshwater. Only the like brackish strains, which you can dig into some evidence on that stuff. There's like even that type of plankton, if the salinity of the mixed waters, let's say the entire Earth became brackish, there's lots of different salinities of brackish waters, and so it would need a very specific one in order to survive. So it's much more likely that all of the plankton died. So we would see this massive fossilization of just this insane biomass of plankton where almost all of it died. Like let's give some of the plankton in brackish waters the benefit of the doubt and say that they survived because the salinity happened to be just right. So like 98% or 99% of plankton would have all died. Plus, we can see plankton throughout the geologic column, growing, evolving, dying, like successive generations. And so the amount, if you're saying that all of that biomass of all the plankton throughout the entire geologic column all died during the flood, it would have been this like, would have been so much of it that the entire ocean that supposedly covered the planet would have just been filled with it. It would have been this kind of sludgy, planktony thing, just because there's been so much plankton life and death during that time. You're basically cramming like millions of years of plankton life and death cycles into 1 year during the flood, and that's just a lot of fucking plankton to try to cram in there. So we don't see this like massive layer of like tons of plankton biomass. What instead we see is plankton living and dying in a layer, because that's how the rock layers got laid down. So it like does its whole life cycle, and then the plankton gets more complex over time, and it just goes through the rock layers like very natural, exactly what you would expect to find. So the fact that plankton is so steady throughout the rock layers is another preclusionary piece of evidence. But like we can just see the plankton doing its plankton thing, getting more complex over time throughout the geologic column. So those are my main pieces of preclusionary evidence. I've got maybe like 10 more, but I just wanted to focus on those because they're the most damning in my opinion. You could wave any of these away with the magic claim, like just be like, oh, the super big alien that created the universe just used magic and made all these problems magically go away, which is fine, but yeah, you can say that about anything. Doesn't make it real. And also the trajectory, as we talked about with the how to think conversation, is that this was the move often with lightning, volcanoes, as I just mentioned. So it's just like, oh, we don't know how that happened, so a god did it. That has been done to death throughout human history, and it's every single time turned out that it wasn't actually a god that did it. It was some sort of natural process. So I don't know why these would be different. It's perfectly possible that we may at some point run into some evidence where it's like, oh, that was clearly some sort of third party intervened there, and we don't understand why this suddenly became that of the thing. We may run into that, but we haven't yet. And even if we did run into that situation, you would then need to clearly tie what happened there to some sort of deity, like instead of maybe just saying, I don't know, and then waiting for multiple years until they figure out maybe that was an actual natural process as well. So again, just because we don't know something doesn't mean it's magic. So then the conclusion for this question is a good question. So I like evidence. What do you think about the evidence for Noah's flood? So I'll do the conclusion, but hopefully I gave you enough evidence, or at least the kind of beginnings of it, so you could follow that up and research it as much as you want to and dig into. I think everyone should be into evidence. So the conclusion to that question is basically this. A massive one-time catastrophe predicts a world where physical clocks are reset, rock strata are completely jumbled, and a biosphere that is freshly reseeded. So all of that evidence would be clear in the rock layers and in all of the different sciences that we study. But instead, we don't see that at all. So in researching this and then also reading the books that my young Earth creationist dad would give me and studying some of these sciences myself, I haven't seen any evidence whatsoever that would support a flood model or a young Earth creationist model at all. But I'm very open to seeing some, as long as it's solid and not just some made up stuff. So that's what we would expect to see. But instead, what we see is every independent line of observation, from rocks to isotopes to climate records to biology, records a deep and very orderly and very internally consistent past that scales from thousands to billions of years. The absence of the predicted global flood signatures, basically none of them exist, as I just went through, coupled with the abundance of long-age natural process indicators, is why the global flood model is rejected by geology, paleontology, physics, climatology, genetics, and archaeology. No one takes it seriously who is seriously studying this stuff. And it's also funny to me that a lot of the people who are young Earth creationists or people who believe in the flood are like, they haven't studied science hardly at all. They just have like a very rudimentary understanding, just enough for the Dunning-Kruger effect to happen, where they hear a little bit of a thing and it seems like kind of plausible, and so they're like, oh yeah, that validates my worldview, so therefore I'm just going to believe that thing. And they think that with their very limited knowledge they can like out think and out reason and outdo people who spend their entire lives doing this. A lot of people don't like the feeling that they're not as smart as someone else, but a lot of these people who are in genetics and geology and paleontology and things are much smarter than the common person who believes in the flood model or young Earth creationism. And that might suck to hear, but that's the reality of it. So if you want to know reality and actually want to face reality, I encourage you to dig into any of the stuff that I mentioned. And if I got anything wrong, please let me know. I'm not a perfect person. Research changes all the time. We learn new things all the time. But overwhelming evidence that I've seen in researching this and also throughout my life is that the flood model doesn't make any sense whatsoever. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. And instead, what we see is a very sort of deep time model just based on actual observation. Like, for example, we can see protoplanetary disks forming in other galaxies. So we can see stars being born, we can see stars dying, we can see when a star is born, the protoplanetary disk forming and planets and moons forming around it. We can watch that stuff happen. The time scale of it is very long, but we can see protoplanetary disks in various stages of development. We can see these things happening. We can see galaxies dying as they crash into other galaxies. We can see stars dying and going supernova. Like this entire life cycle, because we have so many different galaxies that we can look at and solar systems that we can look at, we can literally see these processes happening over time. And with the James Webb Telescope and various additional telescopes that other countries will build, because in America we're probably going to cut our space funding, so we'll be way behind everybody, which is super dumb, but whatever. What these new telescopes will be able to look at, and partially why the James Webb Telescope was built, is because just like we have been able to study how galaxies form and stars form and planets form and all that stuff, we want to go even further and be able to watch like different actual planets form over time. Like what's their atmosphere change like from one time to the next. And so that's what a big part of what James Webb is doing, is looking at different planets at various stages in development. So we can see like, okay, this planet doesn't have any life on it because it's too early. This planet does have life on it, and this is the chemical composition of the air. So the organisms are probably like this stage, like trilobite level or dinosaur level or whatever it is. And by looking at those different planets, we can kind of get an insight into how our planet, the story of our own planet, and how it kind of changed over time. So that's pretty much it. I hope that was a thorough answer to the question. Feel free to ask me any additional questions from anything. I like any kind of science, including like psychology, sociology, anthropology, archaeology, including, and then also some other like harder sciences like chemistry and physics and things too. I'm regularly watching stuff and like multiple things per day. So I just love any of these things. And as we talked about last week, I really like the sort of goal of getting as close to reality as possible and believing as many true things as possible. And it's something that I don't think a lot of people do. So seeing yourself very accurately, seeing the people around you very accurately, seeing situations very accurately, seeing your country very accurately, seeing the world very accurately, seeing the solar system and the galaxy and the universe very accurately is, in my opinion, one of the best things you can do with your time. And also, like I said last week, kind of the point of life. So hopefully that was a very honest and thorough look at the evidence for the flood or lack thereof. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or additional comments, as I mentioned, if you go to fitnerds.club, there's a link here at the top for Ghost Church. I'll get around to building a Ghost Church website at some point. But basically, it's got information, and then you can fill in this Ask This Question box and submit it. And then I will keep them in a queue and get to them over the coming weeks. And I may even make some YouTube content from them. You can sign up for updates. I just kind of was doing this for fun, and then a lot of people have signed up for updates. So I've been slowly getting my my newsletter game together. It's not quite there yet, but I know people are waiting on it, and I'll get there eventually. And then I also, as I mentioned last week, started a Slack. Slack charges me like $9 a user, so you have to pay $10 a month to be a part of it. But then you can talk to me sort of one-on-one. We have a great community of people there. So if you want to be a part of it, have some people to talk to or chat about some of this stuff with, we'd love to see you there. It's a really fun thing. I don't like Discord, so I'm not going to do a Discord. So anyway, that's this week's Ghost Church. I hope you liked it. I will see you all next week. Hope you have a good week. Peace. Bye.